Hello and welcome to Awani Global. I'm Soraya Mia and I'm here at the 37th Asia Pacific Roundtable at Hilton Kuala Lumpur amidst heightened tensions between US and China. And as Malaysia prepares to chair the Association of Southeast Asian Nation ASEAN in 2025 with my esteemed guest, Dr. Victor Gao, who is the Vice President for the Center for China and Globalization. Now, we're going to begin the conversation about a recent survey that reveals a significant shift in Southeast Asia's geopolitical landscape. China is now preferred over the US as the region's leading superpower. Now, let's explore the factors driving this preference and what it really means for the future of US-China relations, especially in the Southeast Asian nation. Thank you, first of all, for joining us on Awani Global. Now, China has edged out the US as Southeast Asia's preferred superpower by a narrow margin, or 50.5 to 49.5. Now, what's the reason for China's growing influence in the region?
Thank you very much for having me. The world we are living in through is definitely not a unipolar world. It is a multipolar world indeed. Multipolarity is a fact that all of us need to live with. As a matter of fact, historically speaking, the international order established back in 1945 upon the Nazi surrender and the Japanese unconditional surrender was not meant to be a uni-world to start with. It was based on balance of power. However, unfortunately, soon it degenerated into a Cold War, and then back in 1991, when the Cold War eventually came to an end, the United States thought, and many believed, that it was the only pole in the world. However, that started to change around the turn of the century, and the United States was very busy doing many other things. And by today, I think the consensus is that it is a multipolar world, and China is one of the very important pole. It is one of the 5 permanent member states of the United Nations Security Council. As a matter of fact, the size of the Chinese economy, if we use purchasing power parity, is already way larger than the United States. If we use official exchange rate, China is still smaller, but then in a matter of years, probably around 2030, if not 2035, the size of the Chinese economy measured by official exchange rate will be larger than that of the United States. And if you believe in Elon Musk, he keeps saying that by the middle of this century, the size of the Chinese economy will be about twice as big as that of the United States. So major changes are happening as we speak. For ASEAN, you may know the largest trading partner for China used to be the United States, then it was EU, and for the past several years, it's ASEAN as a whole. So ASEAN and China have not only very important economic and trading relations, but people-to-people exchanges are very tremendous. We have long history going back into many centuries ago. And I think the crucial important thing is that China and ASEAN respect each other, deal with each other as equal, and we have the free trade zone between China and ASEAN as a whole. And I think going forward, from the Chinese perspective, ASEAN is and will remain a very important partner to be engaged with. And China-ASEAN cooperation will definitely generate miracles for both China and ASEAN, and will make the world a better world.
Besides, the economical benefits that ASEAN can perhaps get from the good relations between, China and ASEAN itself, what do you think are the other concerns, when it comes to ASEAN with China's growing influence?
Well, China has been, historically speaking, a very powerful, very influential country, especially between China and Indochina and ASEAN, as we call it today, and many parts of the world. However, if you look at the Chinese history, for many centuries, China was not an aggressive country. And I remember a former Prime Minister, Mahathir of Malaysia, said, "We do not fear China because we saw China come and go 800 years ago, several hundred years ago, and China itself never took any inch of Malaysia's land." That's true. China does not occupy other land. China does not force any other country to learn Chinese or force anyone to use chopsticks, excluding their way of life, for example. That means China has the tradition of dealing with other countries, other parts of the world, on equal terms, learn from each other, rather than imposing my way of life onto the other party. And I think this will continue going forward. So people-to-people exchanges will remain very important. And now China has many cutting-edge technologies. We want to share this with ASEAN people, including, for example, electric vehicle technologies, battery technologies, AI technologies of all kinds. So I think going forward, in addition to traditional way of promoting economic trade relations, for example, we can really share a lot of the Chinese technological know-how, scientific breakthrough, and as we speak, the Chinese Chang-6 lunar probe is coming back to Earth after spending about 2 days on the further side of the moon, excavating quite a few kind of materials from the moon back to Earth to be analyzed. And on board, there was technology and project proposed by Pakistan. And I hope very soon there will be an ASEAN project to be approved for the future Chang-E lunar probe and other space programs that China will launch in the future.
I'm sure Malaysia would be open to that. Now, aside from fears or concerns on the China side, what about concerns amidst the tension between U.S. and China? Would there be any geopolitical ramifications on the other side?
Talking about China-U.S. deteriorating relations, it is very unfortunate. I coined a term called the Tonya Harding syndrome to describe what I see as the real problem between China and the United States. There was a figure skating champion of the United States, Tonya Harding. She won the national championship. She was worried that her competitor, Nancy Kerrigan, would take over the championship from her. So Tonya Harding and her husband and their associates whacked the kneecap of Nancy Kerrigan, putting her out of competition. But eventually, when the dust settled, Tonya Harding was banned from figure skating championship in the United States in perpetuity. I think Washington is suffering from that Tonya Harding syndrome. They see that China is rising up, China is getting ahead in many ways, so they want to use this kind of a kneecap whacking, try to put China out of competition. This is not the right thing to do. This is not the decent thing to do. And China wants to get along with the United States. The United States is suffering not only from this Tonya Harding syndrome, but they also suffer from two combined nightmares. Let me tell you what these mean. One nightmare is that Washington worries that China will catch up with the United States and eventually surpass the United States. That China will do in a matter of years, especially if you believe in what Elon Musk is telling us. Now, the second nightmare, combined with the first one, is even more toxic. It is that the United States worries that when China is larger than the United States, China may impose China's political system, ideology, ways of life, values onto the United States, pushing the United States away from the center of the global stage and forcing the United States to become a secondary, subordinated country. That China will never do, because China's tradition and commitment is to deal with any country, big or small, as an equal. And China will never impose its political system or ideology on any other country, including, in particular, the United States. So I believe China really need to tell the United States and Washington, the beltways, for example, decision makers in the United States, including the academic side of the equation, that China will never try to subordinate the United States or impose its political system or ideology onto the United States. From the Chinese perspective, it's always your God for you, my God for me. Don't impose your God on me, and I will never impose my God on you. So while China-US relations will continue to deteriorate, I do believe in one thing that I came up with. That is the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. Other people talked about destined for war or avoidable war or unintended conflict, for example. I came up with a higher level of analysis. That is the inevitability of peace. Why? Because both China and the United States are fully armed to the teeth. Both of them are very large nuclear powers. Any war between them will not only alienate the other side, and itself, it will eliminate mankind as a whole. It will lead to Armageddon. So what's the fun of that? I think we need to urge both Washington and China to really be saying, keep the cool of the mind, focus on getting along with each other, overcoming any differences between China and the United States through peace, through negotiation, through diplomatic dialogue, rather than agitating for war. A war between China and the United States will mean the end of the world. So we need to be wary of China-US deterioration of relations, but we need to be confident that China and the United States eventually need to get along with each other.
Yep, I do like that point. However, we've been seeing many dialogue, between the U.S. and China recently at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. There was many push for, calls of communication or effective communication and dialogue. How do you see this going or moving forward?
First of all, a dialogue between China and the United States is good. It's much better than no dialogue or cold shouldering either by China against the United States or vice versa. I personally would urge more dialogue, not only between the two military leaders, but also between the heads of state and the Chinese government and the US government, etc. And on the business community side, for example, Chinese companies and American companies do want to do business with each other. After all, Chinese market is the largest consumer market in the world, and it's ever getting bigger. And for the United States to talk about decoupling, it is a mission impossible. I call the decoupling by the United States like try to decouple the Earth from the moon. It's not possible. Secondly, don't try that. Thirdly, if you succeed in decoupling the Earth from the moon, you get greater disaster. Now the Americans are talking about de-risk. No, it's not possible. Why? Risks are universal. Risks are omnipresent. Everything you see has some risk. The water you drink, you may choke upon it. If you swim in the pool, you may drown. If you walk in the street, a tree may fall on top of you. So risks are to be managed rather than to be de-risked. And any country has some risks and opportunities. If you only look at the risks of a country to the neglect of the opportunities, you completely misread the situation. So no decoupling anymore and no de-risking. Risk management is a must in whatever we do, as a person, as a family, as a company, as a country, as a civilization. So let's talk about the right way in dealing with the challenges and the opportunities.
Now that Malaysia is, going to be the chair of ASEAN in 2025, talking about risk, how do we mitigate the risks that may oppose, from the U.S.-China relations, especially when we talk about ASEAN, the South China Sea impact on the ASEAN-China relations. Maybe you could give your thoughts on this.
Congratulations on Malaysia on becoming the chairman of ASEAN for 2025. I believe Malaysia will be a very important chairman country, presiding over ASEAN for the coming year. Between China and ASEAN, as I mentioned, we really fully respect ASEAN as an organization, and the ASEAN centrality is a very important feature and the megatrend in the world of today. China and ASEAN have this free trade agreement. We want to upgrade that to China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement 2.0, including a lot of intellectual property, cooperation, you name it. Yes, there are some territorial disputes between China on the one hand and several other ASEAN member states on the other hand. But allow me to mention very briefly, the boundary of the Philippines is actually well defined by two major historical events. One was the Spanish-American Treaty of 1898. There was a war between the United States and Spain. Spain lost the war, the United States won the war, and Spain actually transferred the totality of the Philippines to the United States. Therefore, back in 1898, whatever piece of land belonging to the Philippines was taken over by the United States. Whatever the United States did not take over back in 1898 did not belong to the Philippines. There was another important historical event, that is the unconditional surrender of Japan in 1945. Japan not only surrendered to the United States, Japan also surrendered to China. Now, as a part of the Japanese surrender, the United States took back the totality of the Philippines from Japanese occupation. Whatever that belonged to the Philippines was taken back by the United States from Japanese occupation, and whatever the United States did not take back in 1945 did not belong to the Philippines. Now, the other thing, I was licensed as an attorney of law in the state of New York. Let me tell you one thing. Arbitration without consent is against rule of law. Meaning, if anyone tells you, I want to bring you into arbitration without your consent, he or she is violating your basic human rights. No country in the world can bring another country into arbitration without its consent. So when we talk about, or when we hear Washington keeps talking about rule-based international law, number one is arbitration without consent is against rule of law. Therefore, between China and the Philippines, I think we not only have historical data to back it up, we also have the Treaty of the United States and Spain of 1898 and the unconditional surrender of Japan in 1945 as two important bases upon which we really need to look at the territorial disputes between China and the Philippines. And I hope these territorial disputes will be eventually solved through peace and dialogue and negotiation for mutual benefit, rather than, for example, Philippines being urged upon and become a proxy of another extraterritorial country, which may have its own geopolitical agenda, rather than the agenda of all the ASEAN member states.
Speaking more about ASEAN member states and its preferences between the U.S. and China, there is actually a split when we look at ASEAN. Some countries are more pro-U.S. and some are more pro-China. Does this split say anything about ASEAN as a whole?
I think, philosophically speaking, the real choice for ASEAN is not between China versus the United States. The real choice for ASEAN, as well as for all the other countries in the world, is whether China or the United States will do the right thing or the wrong thing. If China does the right thing, why should ASEAN or any other country in the world reject the good thing that China is doing? If the United States is doing the wrong thing, why should ASEAN or any other country follow the wrong leadership? For example, when the United States bailed out of WHO, it's not a good thing for the United States to do, and no country should encourage itself to follow the US leadership. When the United States casted the veto power against recognizing Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations, that's not the right thing to do. No one should follow that decision by the United States. All of us need to fully support the legitimate right of the Palestinian people to have the state of Palestine fully recognized as a full member of the United States. So the choice is not between China versus the United States. The real choice is whether China does the right thing or the wrong thing, or whether the United States will do the right thing or the wrong thing. On that basis, I do hope ASEAN will always keep its own sanity, its brain power, its independence of foreign policy, rather than being dictated by another country. If China does the right thing, cooperate with China. If China does the wrong thing, don't follow China's wrong decision or not wrong action. That should be the better way of choice between China and the United States for the ASEAN member states.
Speaking about choice, although ASEAN has always been, neutral or balanced, now we're talking about balancing relations between ASEAN with China, as well as other global powers like the US, Japan, and South Korea, and even India. How do we actually find a balance there?
Well, if you look from ASEAN's perspective at all these major countries in the world, ASEAN needs to maintain its own centrality, meaning ASEAN is the center. You look at the rest of the world from ASEAN's perspective. Therefore, China is a big neighboring country. It's large, 1.4 billion people, And you may say India has a similar size of the population. Yes, you are right. However, one China today equals more than 5 India. Can you believe it? One China is bigger than 5 India. And this is against the background that back in 1978, China and India were more or less on a par with each other. For 1 or 2 years, India's size of the economy was even larger than China. But you see the complete transformation of China over the past 45 years. And then when you look at India, yes, of course, India is important. Japan is important. Republic of Korea is important. China's Taiwan province is important. In Taiwan, important for ASEAN. United States, always important. So I think ASEAN need to come up with its own very tailor-made specific policies to engage with China, with India, with the United States, with Japan, with Australia, with all these countries, with EU as a whole, for example. But the key is always to promote peace and to oppose war. In that context, I truly believe this AUKUS deal is a very awkward deal because it brings nuclear submarine into Australia. It may destroy the nuclear-free South Pacific zone, for example. It will escalate the tension around on the periphery of ASEAN, for example. So I think we need to really join hands in promoting peace. And if someone says, well, let me send more weapons to the neighborhood or to one of the countries in ASEAN, that may not be the right thing for ASEAN as a whole. ASEAN embracing peace, standing firm to defend peace and opposing war will make ASEAN a more meaningful, more impactful regional and international organization.
Now, probably just one final question before I let you go. Dr. Victor, how do you think the U.S. elections expected in November this year would impact China?
U.S. presidential election
Correct.
is a decision for the American people to decide. China or no other foreign country have any claim in that presidential election. We are witnesses of history. We are observers at best. However, having said that, I would say this presidential election really breaks all records in the United States. President Biden now calls the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, as a convicted felon. And former President Trump is calling President Biden by all names possible. And I never have seen the US presidential election degenerating to such low depth. Some people even say, if you judge the quality and the intensity of the politics in the United States is on the way to become a banana republic. Whether that's true or not, I'm not going to comment. But it's scary. As far as China's relations with the United States is concerned, both Trump and Biden are using China to bash China, try to improve his own possibility of getting election, being voted into the White House. That's bad for China and for the United States. I'm afraid China-US relations will continue to deteriorate for the rest of 2024, and it may even become worse between 2025 all the way to 2029. Whichever becomes the president of the United States. However, I'm very optimistic about the medium-term and the longer-term relations between China and the United States because unlike many others who talk about the destined for war scenario between China and the United States, the avoidable war or the unintended conflict, I come up with my own theory. It's called inevitable peace between China and the United States. Why? Because both China and the United States are armed to the teeth, not only with conventional weapons, but with nuclear weapons. And now China can land a lunar probe on the further side of the moon, which is technologically speaking very, very difficult, if not impossible. The Americans cannot do that. No other country in the world can do that. And China can not only land it once, now it's the second time, and the lunar probe is coming back to Earth as we speak with excavated materials on the further side of the moon. So I think the United States eventually will realize that try to put maximum pressure against China is not going to solve the problem. China and the United States need to respect each other as China does respect the United States. The United States need to respect China as it is and get along with China. The fundamental principle is, as what I said, your God for you, my God for me. Don't try to impose your God on me, and China will never try to impose its God, its political system, ideology, etc., onto the United States. President Xi Jinping has said the right thing. The world is big enough to accommodate one successful United States on the one hand and one successful China on the other hand. And if China and the United States can get along peacefully, the world we are living in will be a better world. ASEAN will have a more meaningful role to play, and mankind will have a brighter and safer future.
That's a very great way to end our discussion today. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Dr. Victor Gao, Vice President of Center for China and Globalization. I'm Soraya Mia. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again.